The desert doesn't lie. That was the first thing Eli Calhoun had learned when he pushed west past the territories that men with soft hands and Eastern educations had drawn on paper maps. Maps that bore no resemblance to the actual living, breathing, murderous beauty of the land itself. The desert didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was, ancient, indifferent, and merciless to fools. It baked bone white under a sun that felt personal in its cruelty. It cracked open the earth like a mouth gone too long without water. It swallowed men whole and left behind nothing but bleached remains and cautionary tales told around fires at trading posts. Eli had ridden into this particular stretch of high desert scrubland 3 years prior with a horse, a rifle, $400 of hard-earned cattle money, and a bone-deep desire to be left alone. He'd found the valley by accident. Most good things came that way. Tucked between two ridgelines of red and ochre rock that caught the afternoon light and turned it into something almost sacred. A shallow depression in the earth, where the grass, though thin and pale, actually grew. Where a natural spring fed down through fissured limestone into a well he dug himself over the course of a brutal, blistered August, where the wind moved through the canyon at night and made a sound like breathing, like the land itself was alive and merely resting. He'd built the cabin with timber hauled from 30 miles east. He'd strung the fence lines himself, post by post, wire by wire, until his hands bled and then calloused over into something that barely resembled human skin anymore. He'd brought in 10 head of cattle that first season and lost 3 to a mountain lion and 2 to a drought that came on so sudden and so vicious it seemed like a personal insult. But the remaining 5 survived, bred, and now he ran 40 head through the valley and up into the north pasture, where the grass grew slightly better in the shadow of the eastern ridge. It wasn't a prosperous life, but it was his. That distinction mattered more to Eli Calhoun than most men could understand. He'd come from a town in Missouri where everyone knew everyone else's business, and considered that knowing a form of intimacy, a bond, a reason to weigh in on your choices with opinions that nobody had asked for. He'd worked for 3 years on a cattle operation outside of Abilene, where the foreman was a man who confused loudness with authority and cruelty with discipline. He'd spent 6 months in a mining camp in Colorado, where 40 men lived packed together like cargo, and the ones who didn't drink themselves stupid at night lay awake listening to the ones who did. He'd wanted silence the way a drowning man wants air. And here, in this shallow valley where the nearest neighbor was a 2-day ride south and the nearest town was further still, he'd found it. Or something close enough to it that the difference didn't keep him up at night. He was 34 years old. He had a scar along his left jaw from a bar fight he hadn't started and had tried very hard not to finish. He had hands that could fix nearly anything mechanical and a patience for broken things. Fence posts, harnessed leather, rusted hinges that he'd never quite managed to extend to broken people. He kept his own counsel. He rode out his boundaries twice a week. He tracked weather patterns the way other men tracked gossip. He talked to his horses when the silence got too thick, which it did sometimes, pressing down on the cabin at night like a physical weight. He was not, by any measure, a man who invited complications into his life. And yet, it was a Wednesday in late July when the complication arrived. Eli had been meaning to check the well casing for 3 days running. The water had started coming up with a faint mineral taste that was new. and he wanted to see whether the limestone lining had cracked or shifted. It was the kind of small but consequential maintenance that a man alone on a ranch couldn't afford to ignore. Water was the difference between staying and leaving, between living and dying. He'd chosen this particular piece of ground partly because of the water. He wasn't about to lose it to negligence. He walked out from the cabin just past noon, when the sun was at its most aggressive and the shadows had pulled themselves into tight pools beneath the scrub brush. The air smelled of hot rock and dry grass, and the particular metallic bite of a sky that hadn't seen clouds in 3 weeks. He was still 20 yards from the well when he saw her. His hand went to the revolver at his hip before his mind had even fully processed what his eyes were showing him. Threat assessment was a reflex out here. You saw something unexpected. You reached for iron. You sorted out the details after. But his hand stopped short of drawing, because what he was looking at wasn't a threat in any conventional sense. She had collapsed against the wooden fence post at the edge of the well platform. Her legs were folded beneath her at angles that suggested she'd simply stopped and fallen where she stood, without the energy or consciousness left to do anything as deliberate as sitting down. She was tall, even folded against the post. Something about her proportions read as exceptional. And her dark hair was tangled with dust and matted in 3 or 4 places with the dark rust brown of dried blood. She wore deer-hide clothing worked with careful craftsmanship, beadwork along the collar and sleeves in patterns that Eli recognized as Apache, though he couldn't have told you which band or what the specific designs signified. Her lips were cracked to whiteness. Her skin, naturally deep brown, had taken on a greyish undertone that spoke of serious dehydration. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid movements. She was alive. Barely. Eli stood there for perhaps 5 seconds, an eternity by his usual standards, running through calculations. Apache girl, alone, badly dehydrated, head wounds suggesting a fall. No horse visible, no companions visible. The ridgelines on 3 sides were empty and still. The desert beyond the northern fence shimmered in the heat. He went to the well. He drew up a bucket, clean and cold from deep in the limestone. He filled the ladle, an old tin thing, dented and serviceable, and carried it to her. Her eyes opened when he crouched beside her. Dark eyes, the deep brown black of rich soil, and in them, despite everything her body was doing, an alertness that startled him. Not the glazed vacancy of someone half dead. Awareness, assessment. She looked at him with the eyes of someone taking inventory, cataloguing him, measuring him, reaching some provisional conclusion. Before he'd said a single word, he held out the ladle. She looked at it, then at him. The calculation in her expression was almost audible, like gears turning. Then she drank. She drank that ladle, and he refilled it without being asked. And she drank again. And he refilled it a 3rd time, and she drank more slowly, the colour beginning to edge back into her face in ways that were almost visible, the grey receding like a tide going out. When she was done, she handed the ladle back without a word, and used the fence post to pull herself to her feet. She stood. She was, in fact, extraordinary in her height. Eli Calhoun was not a small man. He'd topped 6 feet since he was 17, and she met his eye level within an inch or 2. In this territory, in this time, in this context, it was such an unexpected thing that he found himself momentarily unable to form a sentence. She looked at him one more time with those measuring eyes, holding his gaze long enough that it became something more than a glance. A statement, maybe, or a notation. Like she was writing his face down somewhere inside herself, where it would be kept and consulted later. Then she turned and walked north into the heat shimmer without a word, without a backward glance, moving with a deliberateness that suggested her body was running on will more than strength, until the desert haze folded around her and she was gone. Eli stood by his well with an empty ladle in his hand. He told himself that was the end of it. He was wrong in ways that would reshape the rest of his life. But that evening passed the way most evenings did, with the long, heavy labour of a man who works alone. He fed the horses, the black mare he called Duchess, and the bay gelding he'd never gotten around to naming, which had become a point of mild private embarrassment. He walked the eastern fence line, where 2 posts had begun to lean with the confidence of things that have given up. He repaired the squeaking hinge on the corral gate that had been announcing itself every morning for 6 weeks. But his mind kept returning to her, not in any romantic way. He was practical enough to immediately recognize and dismiss that line of thinking as irrelevant to the actual situation. What occupied him was the operational question. Who was she? Where had she come from? Where was she going? The head wounds suggested a fall, from a horse or from a height, and the severity of her dehydration suggested she'd been without water for at least a full day, possibly 2. That meant she'd been moving through desert terrain, injured and alone, for a significant distance. Why alone? Apache didn't typically travel alone in this territory, particularly not women, and particularly not through terrain that brought them close to settler ranches. What were the circumstances that had produced this specific situation? He didn't arrive at answers because he didn't have enough information. What he arrived at instead was the conclusion that he'd probably never know, because she was gone, and the desert had taken her back. And that was simply that. He went to bed telling himself he believed this. He did not sleep well. The horses were restless. He could hear them through the thin cabin wall, the scrape of hooves on packed dirt, the occasional heavy exhale that horses use when they're processing something their senses have detected, but their instincts haven't categorized. Duchess made a sound at around 2 in the morning that Eli had never heard from her before. A sharp, compressed sort of noise that was almost a whinny, but stopped short, like she'd thought better of announcing herself. Eli lay on his cot and stared at the rough-hewn ceiling beams and listened. Nothing followed. Wind. The distant percussion of something moving in the hills. Too far away to identify, predator or prey, or just the land settling. The moon was nearly full and pushed silver light through the single western window in thin rectangles that moved across the floor as the hours went. He told himself the horses were reacting to a coyote, maybe a big cat moving through the perimeter. Eventually, he slept. He saw them at first light. He'd stepped out of the cabin, pulling his suspenders over his shoulders, squinting against a sun that was already putting real heat into the sky, despite having barely cleared the eastern ridgeline. The sky was that particular pale blue that comes before the full colour of morning arrives, fading to white at the edges where the horizon met the rock formations. He was thinking about coffee, and about the north pasture, and about whether the mineral taste in the well water was worth riding to town to consult someone about, which would take 4 days round trip and leave the ranch unattended. He was thinking about these ordinary things when he looked at the northern ridge and stopped thinking about them entirely. The shadows were wrong. That was the first formulation his brain offered him. The shadows are wrong. But shadows don't sit on horseback. Shadows don't hold still with the particular quality of stillness that living things achieve when they are choosing not to move. Shadows don't have the weight and mass and intentionality of what he was seeing. He counted. He got to 15 on the northern ridge and stopped because there were more on the eastern slope. And as he turned his head slowly, with the deliberate calm of a man who knows that sudden movement communicates exactly the kind of information you don't want to communicate, he saw the western slope above the dry creek bed, and there were more there too. Warriors. Apache warriors on horseback, positioned along every high ground with clear sight lines to the valley floor, positioned with the geometric precision of men who understood tactical ground. Spears and rifle barrels catching the early light, every one of them motionless, every one of them watching, not advancing, not making any sound, not displaying any of the aggressive movement that preceded an attack. Just there, a human fence along his horizon, more comprehensive and infinitely more dangerous than any wire he'd strung. Eli's hand moved to his rifle, where it leaned against the doorframe. He'd moved it there from its rack inside the cabin 6 months ago, when a mountain lion had started working the perimeter, and it had stayed there since, a habit he was now very grateful for. He didn't pick it up. What good was one rifle against what he was looking at? What good was one rifle against what might be 300 warriors? Because he'd stopped counting at a point when the mathematics had become both clear and irrelevant. You didn't shoot your way out of this. You didn't run. You didn't hide, because they could see you from 3 directions in clean morning light. You stood in your yard, and you thought very carefully about what your next move was going to be. He stepped off the porch into the yard proper. His boots hit the packed dirt with a sound that seemed outrageously loud in the absolute silence the warriors maintained. The horses were at the far end of the corral, pressed against the fence, with their heads high and their nostrils working, reading the air for information their rider apparently hadn't processed fast enough. Eli stood in the middle of his yard, hands away from his sides, and he thought about the girl, the water, the way she'd held his gaze before she left, and then movement on the northern ridge drew his eye. A single rider breaking from the grouped warriors and beginning a descent down the rocky slope. The movement was controlled and unhurried. The horse picked its way down the incline with the fluid confidence of an animal ridden by someone who'd spent more hours in a saddle than out of one. Not aggressive, deliberate. Eli stood still. The rider crossed the valley floor and stopped 30 yards away, and Eli got his first clear look. He was old, not elderly, but deeply weathered the way men get when they've spent decades outdoors in serious weather. His face was lined with the fine cross-hatching of years of sun and wind and the deeper grooves that come from carrying weight. Not physical weight, but the kind that settles on men who make consequential decisions and live with their consequences. His hair was long and dark with grey cutting through it in dramatic streaks. He wore no paint, no ceremonial markers of war preparation. He wore the authority of someone who'd never needed decorative markers to establish who he was. Command wasn't something you put on. Eli understood this from his years of watching men in various positions of authority. Some who had it, most who were performing a version of it. This man had it. It radiated off him the way heat radiated off the canyon walls in the afternoon. Not aggressive, not performed, simply real. Behind him, more riders had appeared. They flanked out in a loose arc, watching. The silence stretched. Eli didn't move and didn't speak. He had no language in common with this man, and even if he'd been fluent in the dialect, he couldn't have found words adequate to this particular moment. Whatever was happening, it had been decided long before this morning. He was not the author of this scene. He was a character in it, and the plot was not yet visible to him. The warrior raised his right hand, not in greeting, not in threat. He raised it and held it, palm forward, fingers extended, and waited. Eli's heartbeat was doing things that he would normally describe to himself in the clinical language of a man who doesn't like to admit to fear. It was elevated, significantly. His ribs were reporting on its activities with considerable frequency. He thought about what he knew, which wasn't much. He thought about what he suspected, which was more useful. They'd had all night. If death had been the objective, he'd have woken up to fire, or he wouldn't have woken up at all. They'd waited for sunrise, waited for him to see them. That was communicative. That was something other than violence. He took a breath and stepped forward. Not toward the warrior. He matched the gesture, stepped to the center of the space between them and stopped, stood with his hands visible at his sides, mirroring, as best he could in a completely foreign context, the warrior's posture of deliberate stillness. They looked at each other across 30 yards of desert morning. The warrior lowered his hand. Then he dismounted. He walked forward 10 measured paces, like he was counting them, and stopped. Eli walked forward 10 paces and stopped. 50 feet of ground between them. The hawk that appeared overhead seemed to be the only thing in the visible world that wasn't paying attention to this particular negotiation. After a long moment of assessment that Eli felt across the entirety of his skin, the warrior raised his hand again and pointed, not at Eli, at the well. The warrior mimed the act of drinking. It was a simple gesture, unmistakable across any language barrier. Fingers curled around an imaginary vessel, raised to the lips, the slight backward tilt of the head. Then he pointed at Eli, and pointed at the well, and repeated the gesture. "You gave water to someone." Eli nodded. Yes, something shifted in the warrior's posture. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would have been obvious to someone who wasn't already watching him with the totality of attention that Eli was currently bringing to bear. A very small adjustment, like a door opening an inch. He turned his head slightly and spoke in a voice that carried without shouting, the voice of a man who'd never needed to raise it to be heard. And then the eastern ridge parted. The warriors there drew aside, opening a gap in their line, and through that gap a rider appeared. Eli's breath, caught in a way that he later would acknowledge, privately, was the closest he'd come to a genuinely involuntary physical response in years. It was her, but not the girl who'd been collapsed against his fence post yesterday. Not the ash-grey, cracked-lipped, barely breathing woman he'd given water to and watched walk into the desert. This was the same person inhabiting a completely different version of herself. Her hair was braided with precision, decorated with beads in complex patterns that matched the beadwork on her clean deer-hide clothing. A necklace of turquoise and silver caught the morning light. She sat straight-backed on a painted horse, with the posture of someone who'd been raised to understand that how you carry yourself is a form of communication. She was, as he'd registered yesterday but had no adequate framework to process, remarkably tall. Even on horseback, even at a distance, the length of her was evident in the way she occupied space, the way her presence extended beyond the physical dimensions of just one person. She rode down the slope at a controlled pace and crossed the valley floor and didn't stop at a diplomatic distance the way her father had. She rode directly to Eli and stopped 10 feet away, close enough that he could read her face clearly, and she looked at him with that same measuring expression he remembered from yesterday. The inventory gaze, the one that felt like being assessed rather than seen. "You gave water," she said. Her English was careful, each word placed with attention, but clear. The accent was its own music, rhythms that didn't match the English Eli had grown up hearing, emphasis falling on unexpected syllables. "You needed it," Eli said. She glanced at her father and then back at Eli. "You did not know who. No, you were hurt. That's enough of a reason." Something moved behind her eyes. Surprise, maybe, or the recalibration that happens when a situation doesn't match your expectations. She turned to the old warrior and spoke rapidly in Apache, a language that sounded to Eli's ear like water over rock, all flow and percussive consonants. The warrior listened without changing his expression and replied in a single short sentence. The girl turned back to Eli. "My father says you are either brave or a fool." Eli processed this. What's his guess? He has not decided. She held his gaze. "Man who know who I am, he try to get reward. Trade me for favor. Get safe passage. You give water because thirsty person need water. This is different." "What's your name?" Eli asked. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at him for a moment longer, then at her father, then back. "Tasina," she said. "In our language, it means something like spirit or breath, something that moves through and cannot be held." "It suits you," Eli said, and then immediately felt the inadequacy of the statement. But she tilted her head slightly, as if filing this away. "My father will speak now. I will translate. You will listen." It wasn't a question. The old warrior spoke. He spoke with the cadence of someone who'd spent a lifetime thinking carefully before opening his mouth, and the economy of someone who'd learned that the most important things can be said without decorating them. Tasina translated in segments. "My father says I was doing what our people call a passage test. 3 days alone. No food, no water, no horse. Prove strength, prove readiness. He says this is how you learn who you are. When there is nothing to support you but your own self, you find out what that self actually is." She paused. "He says I fell. Lost the path in the dark on the second night, hit my head on rock. He says I came to your well by instinct, the way animals find water. He says your water saved my life." Another pause. "He says he is not a man who ignores what that means." Eli looked at the old warrior. The old warrior met his gaze without expression, but without coldness either. Pure assessment. "Tell him I'm glad she's alive," Eli said. Tasina translated. The warrior listened, then replied. "He asks if you are afraid," she said. "Absolutely," Eli said. A beat. She translated. The warrior's expression shifted by perhaps 2 degrees towards something that might, in better lighting, have been the beginning of a reaction. "He asks why you did not run. Because running wouldn't change the math," Eli said. and because I haven't done anything wrong." Tasina translated. The warrior responded at length. "He says," Tasina said slowly, "that most men run when they are afraid. That fear and action usually go together, huh? Afraid, so run. Afraid, so shoot. Afraid, so beg. He says you are afraid and you stand still. He says this is either wisdom or paralysis, and he is trying to determine which. Tell him I've been trying to figure out the same thing," Eli said. This time, when Tasina translated, the warrior did something unexpected. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was too controlled and too brief to qualify as that. But it was an acknowledgement, recognition of something. "He says," Tasina said, and now there was something new in her voice too, something warmer, "that you will be watched for 6 days, to see what kind of man you are when you believe no one significant is looking, to see if you go to white men and tell them where we are, to see if you send for soldiers, to see if you act from fear or from actual character." Eli absorbed this. "And if I pass?" Tasina looked at him for a long moment. "We will discuss that when it happens," she said. Then she turned her painted horse and rode back up the slope. Her father followed, and the warriors on the ridges settled like stones into positions that would become, over the next 6 days, as much a part of the landscape as the rocks themselves. They were extraordinary at stillness. That was the thing that most unnerved Eli, as the first day stretched into the second, and the second into the third. He'd grown up understanding that the land was mostly empty, that the apparent blankness of the desert meant absence, meant nothing there, but these men revised that understanding completely. The ridges that had seemed bare rock and scrub now contained at all times human beings in numbers he couldn't accurately count from the ground. They moved positions in rotations so subtle he couldn't track the shifts. They were simply always there, and always still, and the effect on his nervous system was cumulative in ways that sleep only partially addressed. He went about his work. What else was there to do? He fed Duchess and the bay. He repaired the fence posts on the eastern line. He dug out a section of well casing that had indeed cracked, and relined it with the spare limestone blocks he'd kept for exactly this possibility. He rode the northern pasture to check on the herd, not at speed, not urgently, moving at the deliberate pace of a man with no particular agenda, which was both true and also the performance of truth. And he felt the eyes on him the entire time, with the almost physical quality of a hand on his shoulder. He didn't go south. He didn't ride toward town. He didn't fire signals or write notes in the dust or in any way attempt to communicate with anyone beyond the confines of his valley. He was, in fact, purely himself, because there was nothing else available to be. The fourth morning brought a surprise. He opened his cabin door and found a bundle on the step, wrapped in hide. Inside, dried meat, dark and heavily seasoned, and a clay jar of water. He stood looking at it for a long time, trying to read the message. Provision, respect, a practical acknowledgement that they needed him functional for the test to continue. He couldn't determine which, and decided eventually that the distinction was less important than the fact itself. Someone had climbed down from the ridge in the dark and left him food. That was not the behavior of people who wanted him dead. He ate the meat. It was excellent, actually, dense with flavor, a preparation he didn't recognize, but which his hunger decoded enthusiastically. The 5th day was the hardest. Not because anything happened, but because nothing did, and the weight of being watched without being able to respond to the watchers. To speak, to acknowledge, to have any reciprocal awareness was a peculiar kind of pressure. He talked to the horses more than usual. He found himself narrating his activities to no one in particular, filling the silence with the sound of his own voice, the way you might fill a dark room with lamplight. He caught himself once, looking toward the northern ridge and simply lifting a hand in the vague direction of whoever was up there. He wasn't sure why. He put his hand back down and went back to work. The 6th day Tassina came back. She came alone this time, without her father, without the escort of warriors. Just her and the painted horse, riding down the slope at the same controlled pace as before, stopping in the yard the same 10 feet away. "You're still here," she said. "Didn't have much choice. You had choices." She swung down from the horse with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd been riding since before they could walk. "At night, take horse, ride south, maybe get away before anyone could follow." "Maybe," Eli said, "or maybe not. And even if I made it, then what? I've run. That tells you something about me. And I'd have to live with having run, which tells me something about me. Neither version is worth it." She studied him. "Most white men run. Then most white men aren't very good at math." Something moved across her face. Brief, not quite amusement, but in its neighborhood. She walked to the well and looked down into it. "Deep," she said. "Deep enough. Doesn't run dry even in August." She ran her hand along the wooden casing, feeling the workmanship. "You build this yourself?" "All of it. Cabin, fence, well, all of it." "Alone?" "I prefer alone." She turned to look at him. "Then why does talking to horses count as company?" He blinked. They'd been watching close enough to hear him talking to Duchess. He decided not to be embarrassed about this. "Because they're better listeners than most people." Now the thing on her face was definitely closer to amusement, though still restrained. She turned back to look at the valley. "My people need water also," she said, and the lightness was gone, replaced by something measured and serious. This land, before the fences, before the wells, before the papers and the names drawn on maps. This land was ours. The water ran free, the game ran free. You could go from here to 3 days' ride in any direction and find what you needed, because the land provided for those who understood it. Eli didn't say anything. "Now there are fences," she said, "and men with papers. And the papers say this is mine and this is yours, and you cannot pass here. The water that ran free is now owned. The land that fed people is now titled." She looked at him directly. "You have fence. Yes. You have well. Yes. But when person need water, you give." A pause. "Even Apache person." "A person is a person," Eli said. "Thirst doesn't ask about your bloodline." She was quiet for a moment. "My father will want to hear you say that." "I'll say it to his face." "I know," she said. "That is why he sent me down, to confirm what we observed." Before either of them could continue, the world made a sound that stopped everything. A gunshot. Distant, somewhere beyond the eastern hills, but unmistakable in the desert clarity, where sound carried without the interference of trees or buildings, or the general noise of civilization. Then a second, then a third, in quick succession, the pattern of shots fired by people in motion and in conflict. Tessina's head snapped toward the eastern ridge. She called out something in Apache, urgent and commanding. A warrior on the ridge shouted back, his voice carrying information in the tones as much as the words. Her expression hardened in the way that happens when information you dreaded arrives, and you have to become the person who deals with it. She turned to Eli. White men, coming this direction, many and armed. Eli felt the cold arrive in his stomach, the way it always arrived in his stomach when the situation changed faster than his planning could follow. How many? 20. Maybe more. She held his gaze, and for the first time since she'd appeared in his yard the previous week, the neutrality in her expression cracked and showed something underneath it. Not fear, something more complex, calculation and concern mixed together. They hunt us. The shots were getting closer, moving at the pace of riders. Where are you going? He asked, already knowing she was about to go. She mounted in one motion. No grabbing, no pulling, just a fluid translation from standing to seated that seemed to skip several intervening steps. If they find you with us, they will kill you. They will think you are enemy. Tessina! But she was already moving, kicking the painted horse into a canter toward the ridge, around him, with a speed and silence that seemed to defy physics. The warriors who'd been visible on the ridges began dissolving back into the landscape, becoming rock and scrub and shadow rather than human beings. They didn't flee. That wasn't the right word. They redistributed. They were still in the hills. They just weren't visible anymore. And from the east, growing louder with the inevitability of a storm that had been visible on the horizon all morning, and had now arrived riders, voices. The particular quality of excitement that distinguishes men who think they're about to catch something. They came over the eastern trail in a plume of their own making, dust rising 20 feet and hanging in the still air as they descended into the valley at a pace that said urgency without saying panic. Eli counted as they came, 15 riders, with possibly more still coming over the rise. They were settlers. He could read it in the clothes, canvas and worn denim and leather that had been repaired rather than replaced, and in the way they rode, which was purposeful but not elegant, men who used horses as tools rather than as partners. Every man carried a long rifle. Several had revolvers additionally. Their faces were flushed with exertion and something else, the hot-cheeked quality of men in the grip of a motivation that felt righteous to them. The lead rider spotted Eli standing in his yard and raised a hand. The group slowed, horses blowing and foam-mouthed. They formed a rough arc facing him, rifles across saddles or in hands, not yet raised, but present and available. The lead rider was a broad man, with a dark beard going grey at the edges, and eyes that moved constantly, scanning the ridges and slopes with the practiced sweep of someone who developed the habit through necessity rather than paranoia. He wore a canvas duster despite the heat. His revolver was on his hip, and his hand was near it in a way that was probably habitual. "You alone out here?" he called. "Just me," Eli said. He kept his hands visible. "What brings 15 armed men down my trail?" A younger rider pushed forward from the group, maybe 25, with the kind of lean intensity that sometimes goes with youth, and sometimes hardens into something more permanent as the years accumulate. His rifle was already in his hands, resting across his saddle at an angle that was technically not aimed at anything, but wasn't pointed away from anything either. We're tracking Apache. War party. We've been on their sign for 3 days. Trail led straight into this valley." Eli's mind ran the options in the time it took him to take one breath. He could tell them the Apache had passed through and moved on. Clean, simple, probably temporarily convincing. But these weren't inexperienced men. They'd followed tracks for 3 days. They'd find the evidence of 6 days' occupation on these ridges and slopes soon enough. And then the lie would become a different kind of problem than the truth. "I've seen sign," Eli said carefully. "They're gone now. Moved out about 20 minutes before you came down the trail." "Gone where?" The bearded man's eyes stopped their scanning and fixed on Eli with an attention that was its own form of pressure. "North, I think. Heard them pulling back." Not a lie exactly. The warriors had pulled back into the hills. North was his best guess at their direction, offered with the honest qualifier of it being a guess. The young rider was not satisfied with this. He studied Eli's face the way people study faces when they're looking for the thing the face is trying not to show. "You've got a lot of nerve, living out here alone. Apache territory." "It's my land," Eli said. "Bought and paid for." "Apache don't care about deeds," the bearded man said. He swung down from his horse and walked toward Eli, closing the distance to conversational range. "You're lucky they haven't killed you already. That or something's protecting you." His eyes moved to Eli's chest. But the necklace wasn't there yet. Eli wasn't wearing it yet. This was 3 weeks before that. The man's eyes found nothing of note and returned to Eli's face. "How long have they been in this valley?" "Hard to say," Eli said. "I first noticed sign a few days back." "How many?" "Enough that I didn't go looking for the answer." The bearded man studied him. "You seem awful calm for a man who's had hostiles camped on his doorstep." "Panic doesn't add useful information to a situation," Eli said. "I've been going about my work and staying out of their way, and they've been staying out of mine." "That's not how Apache work," the young rider said. His voice had an edge on it that went beyond skepticism into something more personal. "They don't just leave settlers alone. They raid, they burn, they kill families." "Some do," Eli said. "Some settlers raid Apache camps and burn those and kill those families too. Seems like a bad business all around." The silence that followed this statement was the kind that has temperature. He'd said something that landed differently than he'd intended, or possibly exactly as he'd intended without fully calculating the social cost. The men exchanged looks. "We've got families that were burned out," the bearded man said quietly. His voice had lost some of its aggressive energy and replaced it with something grimmer. "A settlement, 2 weeks south, 3 homesteads. A family, man, woman, 2 children, killed. We tracked the war party that did it and followed them here." He looked at Eli steadily. "Those are real people, not abstractions, real people with names." Eli met his gaze. "I'm sorry about those people," he said. "Genuinely. No family should die like that. But the Apache who were in this valley, they didn't raid anyone. They've been here 6 days, and they haven't touched my stock, my buildings, or me. I have no reason to believe they're connected to what happened at your settlement." "You have no way of knowing that," the young rider said. "No," Eli agreed. "Neither do you." Before the tension could resolve itself in any particular direction, one of the men who'd spread out along the perimeter called out from the eastern fence. "Found fresh tracks over here, Lots of them. Multiple days' worth. They were camped here. This wasn't a pass-through. The bearded man's expression shifted. His hand moved to his revolver, not drawing, but checking its presence. The gesture of a man whose threat assessment has just changed. He looked at Eli with new eyes. "You lied." "I said they'd gone." "That's true. I said I'd seen sign." "Also true. I didn't volunteer the full history." "Why not?" The question was direct. It deserved a direct answer. Because 20 minutes ago they were still in these hills, and 20 armed men riding and shooting was going to get people killed on both sides. People who don't need to die today. People who massacred families. If they're the same people, which you don't know. Eli faced him squarely. "How many Apache did your militia kill on the way here?" The question landed in silence. "None," the bearded man said after a moment. His voice had changed again, something complicated moving through it. "Because they're better at this territory than you are," Eli said. "They've been living it for generations. If they'd wanted to fight you on the trail, you'd have had a very bad 3 days. They're not fighting because they're not the ones who want a war today, which either means they're innocent of what you're blaming them for, or they're waiting for better ground. Either way, charging into their territory with 15 rifles wasn't going to get you the result you wanted." The bearded man stared at him for a long moment. Something was working itself out behind his eyes. And then the valley filled with sound. It started on the northern ridge. A single call, high and piercing, falling through 2 notes in a pattern that didn't match any bird Eli knew. Not quite human, not quite animal. Something that occupied the space between the 2 categories with absolute intention. Every man in the militia went still. The call repeated. And then from the south, an answer. From the east, another. From the west, the valley filled with sound from every direction. The calls overlapping and answering each other in a pattern that was clearly not random, clearly communicative, clearly the work of people who were very close and very aware and very much in control of the situation they were describing. "They're still here," the young rider whispered. His rifle shook. The bearded man scanned the ridges with the systematic sweep of someone looking for something and finding nothing. Because the Apache who were making those sounds were invisible, folded into the landscape with a perfection that 15 tired men on horses were not equipped to counter. The calls continued, getting closer, or seeming to, the acoustic trick of surround sound creating the impression of an encircling movement, even if no one was physically moving. The bearded man made his decision. "Mount up. We're leaving. We came here to find raiders, not to get cut down in a box canyon by 300 warriors on their own ground. Mount up." The scramble was undignified in the way that survival decisions often are. Men grabbed reins and found stirrups with less grace than they'd have preferred. The young rider kept his rifle up and his eyes on the ridges as he backed toward his horse, covering the group's retreat with the determination of someone who'd decided that visible courage in withdrawal was the available form of courage. Within 2 minutes, they were all mounted. The horses wanted to run, and the riders were letting them. The bearded man looked down at Eli from the saddle. "You're a fool if you stay here." "Maybe," Eli said, "but it's my home. Won't be a home when they burn it. They've had 6 days to burn it. They haven't." The man looked at him for a moment longer. something passing through his expression that was too complicated to read quickly. Then kicked his horse south. The group departed at speed, the sound of their passage fading into the desert within minutes. The calls stopped. Silence settled over the valley with the texture of something physical, a presence rather than an absence, then movement on the northern ridge. Tassina appeared first, on her painted horse, riding down the slope at the same deliberate pace she always used. Behind her, her father. Behind him, warriors in number. They descended to the valley floor and stopped. Tassina dismounted and walked to Eli. "You did not tell them where we were," she said. "No." "You could have." She wasn't accusing him. She was establishing a fact, building something with it. You could have pointed. They would have been grateful. You would have been safe in their eyes. "I'm safe now," Eli said. This seemed like the better option. She studied him for a long moment. The full weight of that measuring gaze, the one that had started at the well a week ago and had apparently never stopped. Then she turned to her father and spoke. The old chief listened, watching Eli over his daughter's shoulder. He replied, "My father says the test is complete." Tassina said, "You pass." And Eli Calhoun felt something shift in his chest that he recognized, after a moment, as the physical sensation of tension he'd been holding for 6 days, releasing all at once. "What happens now?" he asked. Tassina's expression did something he hadn't seen it do before. It moved toward warmth. Not all the way there. This was not a woman who moved all the way anywhere quickly. But it moved. "Now," she said, "we talk." The old chief, whose name Eli learned he was not to know, as a name is a form of power, and its use was earned rather than granted, walked into Eli's cabin without asking permission and without aggression. He walked the way he rode, with the certainty of a man who occupies whatever space he's in completely. Eli followed, feeling the peculiar inversion of being a guest in his own home, and found that he didn't resent it. He found, actually, that the sensation was clarifying. This was what it had always been like for these people. On their own land, in their own territory, being the guests of men who'd arrived with papers and called it possession. The chief stood in the center of the cabin's single room, taking in its spare furnishings with an attention that missed nothing. A table, 2 chairs, a cot, shelves along one wall holding supplies and tools arranged with the logical precision of a man who lives alone and needs to find things quickly. A single window facing west, the rifle on its rack beside the door, hooks for coat and hat, and the coil of extra rope. Nothing decorative, nothing held for its own beauty rather than its function. The chief spoke. Tassina translated. He says, "You live like a warrior. Simple, without extra weight. He says this tells him something about how you think." "What does it tell him?" Eli asked. Tassina posed the question. The chief replied, "He says a man who lives without excess is a man who has chosen what he needs. A man who has chosen what he needs is a man who can be trusted with what he says he wants, because such a man does not lie to himself about his own requirements." Eli sat down at the table. The chief sat across from him, taking the other chair with the unhurried deliberateness of a man for whom sitting was a deliberate act, and they faced each other across the worn wood surface. Tassina positioned herself standing where she could see both men and the door simultaneously. "My name," she said, introducing herself properly for the first time, without being asked. Tessina. In my language, it means spirit, like breath that moves through and cannot be held in one hand. A pause. White men sometimes make joke, because I am tall. My father says I am tall like a mountain is tall, because I was made for this land, which is not small. It's a true name, Eli said. She tilted her head slightly. What is a true name? A name that fits the thing it names, that tells you something real about what it's naming. She considered this for a moment, then translated it for her father. The chief listened and replied, He says in our tradition, a name is a truth. It is chosen because it is already real, already part of the person, not assigned before the person is known, but discovered as the person becomes themselves. He says your people give names before they know who the child will be. This is how your people think about many things, deciding the truth before looking at it. Eli felt the precision of this land on him. That's fair, he said. The chief spoke at length. Tessina translated in segments, her voice careful. He says, You gave water to my daughter when she fell. You did not know who she was. You did not calculate the value of giving or the cost of withholding. You did not see an Apache girl and think, What is this worth to me? You saw a person who needed water, and you gave water. He says this is what our people call basic humanity. He says he is old enough to have seen it become rare. He paused, and the chief continued. He says, For 6 days we watched you. We have watched many white men in many situations. We watched them lie and calculate and perform. We watched them choose the safe action when the right action was different from the safe action. We watched them treat land as possession and people as either threats or tools. He says you did not do these things. You went about your work. You spoke honestly to the men with guns, as honestly as you could without betraying us. You did not perform courage. You demonstrated it, which is different. Another pause. He says he has a gift, and that the gift comes with a cost, and both the gift and the cost must be accepted together, or not at all. The chief reached into a leather pouch at his belt. What he set on the table between them was wrapped in a square of soft cloth, folded with care. He unwrapped it slowly, with the attention of someone revealing something that matters. Inside was a necklace, beadwork on a leather cord, blue and white beads arranged in a pattern that was clearly intentional, clearly meaningful, with a precision of design that spoke of both time and skill invested. The leather was soft and well worked, the kind of softness that comes from proper preparation rather than age. This is a mark of protection, Tessina said. Her voice had changed slightly, become more formal, the way voices become when they're carrying something that has weight beyond its immediate content. You wear this, and my people will know you. Every Apache who sees it will know you are under the protection of our chief. They will not harm you. They will not take your animals or your supplies. If trouble comes from any direction, they will consider it trouble for us also. Eli looked at the necklace, then at Tessina, then at the chief. Why? He said. Because the question seemed the only honest response. Because you showed honor when honor was not required, Tessina said. Because you had the power to betray us and chose not to use it. Because my father has lived long enough to know that this is not common, and that uncommon things deserve recognition. The chief spoke again, Longer this time. Tasina translated carefully. He says, "This land was once all our land, not because we owned it the way you own things, with papers and fences, but because we belonged to it and it sustained us. We knew it and respected it, and took from it only what we needed. We gave back what we could. It was a relationship, not a possession." She paused. "He says the white men came, and they did not want a relationship. They wanted ownership. They could not understand the difference. He says this is the source of everything that has gone wrong between our peoples. Not evil. He does not say your people are evil. He says they are people who know only one way of relating to land and to other people, which is to possess and control, and they are doing what they know, which is not the same as doing what is right." Another pause. "He says you are different, not because you are without fences or without deed, you have both, but because when a person needed water, you gave water. You did not ask, 'Is this person mine to help?' You did not calculate your obligation. You simply responded to a human need with a human response." The chief pushed the necklace across the table toward Eli. Eli looked at it for a long moment. "Tell him I understand the gift," he said. "Tell him I need to understand the cost." Tasina translated. The chief replied. "He says the cost is this. The men who came here today will come back. Others will come. Word travels and men follow word. They will see this mark and they will know what it means. Some of them will understand it as trading with the enemy, as betrayal, as putting yourself outside the protection of your own people." A pause. "He says you cannot have protection from us, and also have full acceptance from them. The line between our peoples is drawn in blood, and standing on one side of it means standing away from the other." Eli sat with this. He thought about the bearded man's face, the young rider's rifle, the settlers who'd lost a family and deserved the right to their grief and their anger, even if the grief and anger were now pointed in directions that were more available than accurate. He thought about the girl collapsed against his fence post, the colour of her face when she'd been fighting through severe dehydration, the particular dignity of the way she'd drunk and then stood and then walked away. Not performing gratitude, not making a transaction of it, just taking what she'd needed and going. The intelligence in her eyes, the accuracy of her father's words. He thought about what it meant to have people, and whether people was determined by bloodline or by shared values, and whether a man's obligation ran to the group he'd been born into, or to some broader category of thing he'd chosen to believe in. He thought about the bearded man saying, "You made your choice, live with it." And he thought, yes. He picked up the necklace and put it over his head. The beadwork settled against his chest. The leather was cool against his skin for a moment, then began to warm to his body temperature. He looked at the chief across the table. "I choose to live with honor," he said. "Same as I've been trying to do. If the cost of that is losing the goodwill of men who wouldn't recognize honor if it shot them, then that's the cost." The chief looked at him for a long moment. Then he stood, walked around the table, and placed one hand briefly on Eli's shoulder. The gesture lasted perhaps 2 seconds. It needed no translation. Tasina, watching from her position by the door, said quietly, "My father says you are either brave or very stupid." "Yeah," Eli said. "He said that the first time. He says stupid brave men sometimes become necessary." She paused. "He did not say legends. He said necessary. This is higher." The chief moved toward the door. Tessina followed, then paused at the threshold and looked back at Eli with that measuring gaze one more time. Something in it had changed over the course of the conversation. It was still assessing, still careful, but it had incorporated something warmer into its calculus. "You may ask one question," she said. "My father will hear it and answer if the answer is his to give. Ask while this moment is real, before the world becomes complicated again." Eli thought. He had 100 questions, practical, philosophical, historical, personal. He sorted through them with the efficiency of a man who's used to making decisions under pressure and choosing the one that mattered most. "The test," he said. 3 days alone, no food, no water. Did you pass?" Tessina's expression didn't change immediately. She let the question settle. Then she said, "I survived. Survival is passing, in the technical sense. But not the way you planned." "No." She was quiet for a moment. "I fell. I needed help. In the strict reading, a warrior who cannot complete the passage without help has not demonstrated full readiness. Some of my people would say, I failed. What do you say?" She looked at him with directness that had been consistent from the beginning, from the moment she'd looked up from the fence post with those dark measuring eyes to this. "I say, I learned more from falling than I would have learned from staying upright. I say strength is not always the thing that gets you through. Sometimes what gets you through is the willingness to accept help when help arrives. Sometimes the passage teaches you something other than what you prepared to learn." She glanced at her father, then back at Eli. "My father says the test was his test also. He says he learned something from the way it ended. He says the lesson that arrives unexpected is sometimes the most important lesson." The chief called from outside, short, commanding, the voice of a man who moves with the economy of someone whose time is always worth something. Tessina stepped through the door. "My people go north, summer grounds. It becomes dangerous to stay anywhere too long. The world your people make for mine gets smaller every season." "Will you come back?" Eli asked. She was already at her horse. She mounted with the fluid motion that he'd watched multiple times now and still found genuinely remarkable. "Maybe," she said, "if we need water, if we need to remind ourselves that not all things are lost." She looked at him from the height of the saddle. "And maybe to see what kind of man you become when the choice has cost you something." "What if the cost is more than I expected?" "Then you will know whether you made the right choice," she said simply. "And that is worth knowing." She turned the horse. Her father was already riding. The warriors gathered and moved with that uncanny coordinated silence, dissolving into the hills in a withdrawal that was so organized it resembled a tide going out. A vast, living thing choosing its direction. Tessina looked back once from the ridge. She raised one hand. Then she was gone, and the valley was empty, and the silence was the loudest thing for miles. 3 weeks of quiet, not the watched silence of the 6 days under assessment. A different kind. The genuine quiet of a man alone on his land, with his animals and his work, and the ordinary rhythm of a life built on useful labour. Eli found himself moving differently through the days. Something had changed in the quality of his solitude. It was no longer the absence of people. It was the presence of a choice. He kept the necklace on. He didn't hide it, and he didn't display it. He wore it the way he wore his hat and his belt, as a functional part of being who he was. Tuesday morning brought dust on the southern trail. 8 riders this time, fewer than the first group. But Eli noticed immediately that these were better armed, more deliberate. The bearded militia leader from 3 weeks prior. And with him, men who had the look of people who'd had time to think about what they'd seen, and to be angry about it in the organized way that turns into purpose. They formed a half-circle in his yard, with rifles visible. The communication of this was not subtle. "We heard rumors," the bearded man said. His eyes went immediately to the necklace. "Rancher, out here, been trading with the Apache, wearing their colors. Looking at you now, I'd say the rumors were running behind the facts." "Not trading," Eli said. "Living in peace. There's a difference." "From where I'm standing," the young rider said. And there was the particular anger of someone who'd been thinking about this for weeks and had arrived at conclusions. A white man wearing Apache markings is standing on the wrong side. Wrong side of what? Of this war. Eli looked at him steadily. "What war? I haven't seen a war. I've seen men who want one. I've seen grief and anger looking for targets. That's not the same as a war, unless you make it one." The bearded man dismounted. He was slower than before, more deliberate. "We came to give you a chance to explain yourself, man to man." "Then I'll explain. I gave water to a dying girl, and she turned out to be the chief's daughter. He tested me for 6 days. I didn't betray his people's location to your men when you came through, because they hadn't done anything to me, and I had no evidence they'd done anything to you. He gave me protection in exchange. I accepted it." Eli met each man's eyes in turn. "That is the complete story." "Simple as that," the young rider said, contempt sharpening his voice. "Simple as that. And you don't think that makes you a traitor?" "Traitor to what?" Eli said. "To men who ride into a valley looking for people to punish? To a cause that's less about justice than about having someone to be angry at?" He let the words settle. "You came through here 3 weeks ago with 15 rifles and found 300 warriors and turned around. Not because you're cowards. I don't think you are. Because you're not idiots. You understood the math. I understood the math 3 weeks before that and made a different calculation." He spread his hands. "I chose not to fight a war that didn't need to happen. If that's treason, then treason's a more complicated thing than you're making it." "Families got burned," the bearded man said quietly. "Real people." "I know." Eli's voice was quiet too. "I'm not minimizing that. Whoever did that, if it was Apache, and I note that if, because you've been following tracks for weeks and still haven't caught anyone, they should face consequences. But these particular Apache didn't raid anyone. They tested a rancher who gave water to their chief's daughter. That's what happened in this valley." The young rider looked like he was deciding between options that both made him uncomfortable. The anger was still there, but something else was working against it now. Doubt, maybe. The kind of doubt that's more difficult to sustain than certainty. Eli spread his arms wide, making himself an open target. The necklace hung visible, the blue and white beads catching the morning light with an absolute lack of apology. "If you're going to shoot me," he said, "do it now. I'm not hiding what I am or what I chose. You want to make me an example? Here I am. But if you came here for a conversation, then let's have it like men." The silence stretched. The horses shifted weight and breathed. A hawk called overhead, the same species of casual observer that had been present at every significant moment in this particular stretch of desert over the past several weeks. The bearded man holstered his revolver. He hadn't drawn it, but his hand had been near it. Now it moved away. "You're a damn fool, Calhoun. But you're a consistent one, and I'll give you that." He turned to his men. "Mount up. We're just letting him. He isn't the problem," the man said. His voice was tired in a way that went past physical fatigue. "He isn't raiding settlements. He isn't killing families. He's a stubborn man who made a stubborn choice on his own land, and it's his to live with." He mounted and looked down at Eli one final time. "Don't expect us to come to your defense if this goes wrong." "I don't," Eli said. "Your choice. Live with it." "I intend to." They rode south. The young rider looked back once, and the expression on his face was less angry than it had been. Something more conflicted had replaced the clean, available anger with something more difficult to carry. Then they were gone, and Eli Calhoun stood alone in his yard, with the necklace warm on his chest, and the valley empty around him, and the full weight of the choice he'd made, and the full knowledge that he'd make it again, and the understanding that these two facts together constituted something he didn't have an exact word for. Peace, maybe. Not comfort, not ease, not the absence of difficulty, but peace. The kind that comes from knowing where you stand. Evening came down across the valley in bands of orange and gold, the sun dropping behind the western ridge and turning the rock faces into something that looked like art before the light failed, and they became rock again. Eli went to the well. He drew up a bucket, the same motion he'd made 10,000 times, the crank handle familiar as his own heartbeat, and carried it to the trough, where Duchess and the bay were waiting with the patient expectation of animals who've learned that the evening water always comes. He poured it in, and watched it splash and settle and still. The bay gelding drank first, which was usual. He'd stopped wondering about the horse's name. The horse didn't seem to need one. He understood what he was to Eli, and Eli to him, and names were for the convenience of people who needed categories. Movement on the western ridge caught his eye. A single rider, tall and straight in the saddle, on a painted horse, silhouetted against the last of the orange light. Tassina, sitting still on the high ground, watching, making sure he'd survived the afternoon's confrontation, making sure the choice had held. He looked up at her. She raised one hand. He raised his in return. She turned the horse and disappeared into the shadows gathering in the hills, becoming part of the landscape the way the Apache always became part of whatever landscape they were in. Not visitors to the land, but expressions of it. Eli stood at the well until the sky finished its transition and the first stars appeared, clear and immediate in the desert air. He touched the necklace. It was warm from his skin, no longer the cool of worked leather and traded beads. Something else now, a declaration. A line drawn in the dust that he'd stood on one side of and would stand on one side of, for whatever time he had left to stand on things. He thought about what Tassina had said. Peace takes more courage than war. Anyone can fight. It takes something specific to choose not to fight when everyone else wants blood. He thought about her question. "Are you afraid?" And his answer, "Absolutely." And the fact that fear hadn't changed what he did, which was maybe the only definition of courage that made actual sense. He went inside, lit the lamp, sat down to his meal. Outside, the valley breathed. No armies on the ridges, no riders on the trail, no choices waiting to be made that night, just land and sky and the long, ancient quiet of a desert that had been here long before him and would be here long after, indifferent to human drama, patient with human folly. He had given water to a girl who needed it. The consequences had been extraordinary. He would give water to the next person who needed it, Apache or settler, stranger or enemy, and the consequences of that might be extraordinary too. It wasn't a policy. It wasn't a philosophy. It was just who he was, distilled down to its simplest expression. A person in need of something, and a person able to provide it, and the decision made without calculation, made from something older than strategy, to give. In a territory being torn apart by the mathematics of us and them, by the algebra of land and ownership and righteous violence, he had found a different equation. Simpler, older, more durable. Thirsty person needs water. Give water. It wasn't much of a legacy, Eli Calhoun knew, but it was an honest one. If this story moved something in you, if you believe that honor still means something in a world that keeps trying to convince you it doesn't, then click the video on your screen right now. Another story is waiting for you. A different frontier, a different choice. The same question that never gets old. What kind of person are you when it costs you something to be good? Subscribe so you never miss the answer. And if this story earned it, leave a super chat. Every story we tell exists because people like you decided it was worth telling. And in the end, in the long run, in the deep reckoning that comes when the dust settles and the guns go quiet and the land remains, honesty was the only thing that lasted. The lamp burned, the stars turned, the well held water, and somewhere in the hills to the north, moving through shadow towards summer grounds, Tasina rode with her people, carrying the knowledge that not everything that was being lost in this territory was gone yet, that somewhere in the shallow valleys and the thin grass and the sparse human arithmetic of the frontier, something was still choosing to be good. That had to count for something. In the end, that was all any of it counted for. The desert doesn't lie. It simply waits to see what you are when there is nothing left to hide behind. Eli Calhoun found out, and what he found was enough.